Hi, everyone. I apologize if you can hear My Little Pony video game noises in the background. My 5-year-old is in here with me. So just a brief sort of overview of can science answer these questions? So just as a reminder, the goal was not to say whether or not you agree or disagree with the questions or whether or not you know the answers to the questions, just to simply tell me, is science the correct tool, if you will, that would be used to answer a question? And so hopefully you all listened to or watched the video that I posted for part of chapter 1 for last week, and possibly even read part of chapter 1 from your book. Essentially, there's some important things to keep in mind. Okay, so some common misconceptions and sort of some other things. So one very important aspect of science is that science only deals with empirical evidence, okay? Things that can be observed in one way or another. A lot of people tend to internalize that as visual. It doesn't necessarily have to be visual observation. It can be something else that's measurable, okay? So empirical essentially means the same thing as measurable, all right? So how far away is the planet Venus? That can be measured. Therefore, science is the right tool for that. Uh-oh, somebody's lurking. Hey, I'm making a video, okay? I'm gonna ignore you. Go back to playing. Okay, so why are the head feathers of a golden eagle golden, right? This is another one. There's different ways that science can answer this. It could look at the genetics of like, what are the actual, what is the DNA sequence that is responsible for producing that coloration? Science could also ask, what is the ecological benefit of having golden feathers, right? But all of those, once again, are science questions. They're things that are empirical, right? You can actually find measurable data to support them. Okay. Best way for me to use the adult years of my life, right? So almost all of you got this. This is definitely an opinion thing because best is subjective, right? We all have a different kind of feeling about what is best for us that can be influenced by all kinds of different external factors. So science is definitely not the right tool for that. How did the solar system form? This one is a little tricky for some people because a lot of people are sort of under the impression that it has to be observed in real time in order for science to work. So obviously, when the solar system formed, there were no humans. So there were no humans to observe it while it happened. Okay. But that doesn't mean that there isn't evidence now that we can observe that sheds light on explaining how it happened, right? So many times, there are events that occur in the past where we still see evidence of how those events played out. Okay. So that is definitely another one that science can answer. Question 5, is there a God? This is another one that was not very tricky for most of you. One other really important thing about science to remember about science, Pickle, I'm gonna have to pause. I'll be right back. Sorry, I was hoping to ignore. It didn't go well. So is there a God? Another really important aspect of science that you need to know is that science only deals with things that are observable, meaning that anything in the realm of supernatural is simply outside of the realm of science. That doesn't mean that it's not an important part of the human experience. It just means that science isn't the right tool to be used for those sorts of things. One of the things that makes me really irritated is when people try to apply science to things that are supernatural, like those TV shows where they try to like ghost hunters, they try to use science to find ghosts. It's like, no. The whole point of supernatural things is that they are outside of the natural world, and the natural world is what science is limited to. Okay, so the answer to that, of course, is no. One other misconception, though, that a lot of people bring in, Ellie, stop. A lot of people bring in with this is, I noticed in several people's answers, and this is not uncommon, right? is that people say things to the effect of, you know, science and religion are opposed to one another, or they're enemies, or they're opposites somehow, or they don't mix, or, you know, things like that. Okay. And so what I hope that you will come to realize over the course of this semester is that while science and faith are very different tools, they both exist in one individual, right? So all of the different tools that are used to seek truth and learn about the world are important, right? But you use different ones for different things. That doesn't mean that they are opposed to one another, right? So when we start talking about, you know, historical important scientific discoveries, many times the people who made those discoveries were very religious people, right? And the way that they approached science is they were interested in learning about what they thought of as God's creation, right? And so there is no opposition between religion and science. That's manufactured, right? That doesn't exist. Some of the most some incredibly brilliant scientific minds are also people of very, very deep faith. Okay. So anyway, all right. Okay. Question 6. Is it right for a couple to continue a pregnancy even when they know the baby will likely be born with a serious defect? This is another one where, you know, many of you were correct that no, science isn't the only tool to use for this. Now, science may be part of it, right? So I just said a second ago that in all of us, there are multiple ways that we all seek truth and seek meaning, right? And those are based on all different kinds of things. And so it, depending on what your belief system is, could be very useful for you to use science to understand what might be going on in a pregnancy, right? Do you take genetic tests to find out what's going on? Do you have ultrasounds performed so that you can see how the baby is developing? All of that is science, right? It's observation, okay? What you choose to do about that, though, might be based on issues of faith or moral compass or ethics. And so science should not be the only tool that you use to make a decision like that, but it might play a role in how you make a decision. Okay. So this one's kind of, you know, maybe it's part of it, but it certainly isn't the whole thing. Okay. Because there's all that ethical stuff. Was T-Rex a fast or slow moving dinosaur? Once again, humans were not around then, so we cannot detect that by direct observation, but we can look at their bones, because their bones have markings that indicate where musculature would be. We can learn about their metabolisms based on their size, based on all different kinds of things. And so that would be something where scientists can figure out, right, something about how different dinosaurs moved, even though nobody was around at the time to directly observe them. I can talk. Why do leaves turn color in the fall? Right? That's another one. We can actually measure what's different in a leaf that's green versus a leaf that's orange, right? What has changed, right? We can directly observe that. Another one that was sort of tricky for some people, and it always is, was question 9. Does sex drive in human males decrease with age? This is absolutely something that is scientific, right? In the sense that you can measure hormone production, right? You can actually, now, whether or not it does, we're not trying to decide that here. I'm just asking you, is science a tool that can be used to measure that, right? And science can be used to measure all kinds of aspects of that, right? Science can be used to measure hormone production. Science can be used to measure brain activity, okay? So absolutely, science can be used to answer a question like that. Okay. Do people who pray about their illnesses get better because a divine power healed them? This is one of my favorites because if you just stopped it in the first half of the sentence, then you might say science could answer a question like that. So, do people who pray about their illnesses get better? Stop it there. Okay. That would be easy enough to study, right? In fact, it has been studied. So in this little document is a link to a really nice, like short article, really easy to read, that explains one of the studies that was used for this. Okay. The part where it gets sort of out of the realm of science is when we start because a divine power healed them, right? Because once again, supernatural, not measurable. So you can't do that. Okay. One last kind of wrap up thing I want to say about all of this, and this kind of goes back to that idea of people having the impression that science and religion or science and faith are somehow opposites or, whatever, right? Enemies. Okay. Let's say on any given weekend, you have a to-do list of things that you need to get done. Okay. One of them is you need to get your tires on your car changed, right? Or rotated and balanced or whatever. You need to get your alignment fixed. Okay. Another thing you need to do on that weekend is you need to go to a bakery to select a birthday cake that you want made for a fancy birthday party that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Okay. So those are two different tasks that one single person might do. And both of those tasks will involve using somebody else's skills, right? So unless you are a baker or you are a mechanic, and you might be one or both of those things, right? But many of us are not. Okay. So would you take your car to the baker to get your tires changed, to get your tires rotated and balanced, to get your um, alignment fixed? Probably not, because your baker isn't the best tool to do that, right? Likewise, you probably wouldn't go to your, local Firestone to have them bake a cake for you, because they're probably not the best tool for that, right? Maybe you go to a bakery where somebody who, has some practice baking can make you that fancy cake. Okay. Is one of those things better than the other? Depends on what you need. It depends on what you care more about in that particular moment, right? Are those two things opposed to each other? There's no fight between your mechanic and your baker, right? They're just helping you with different aspects of your life. And so if you are feeling this idea that somehow science and religion are at odds with one another, I want you to think about your mechanic and your baker, right? You can use both of them for different things. One of them isn't going to solve all of your problems, right? But you use each one for a different part of your life to make your life a little bit better. Okay. So think about it that way. And so one of the benefits, no matter what your major, one of the benefits of taking a science class like this one is so that you, even if you are not going to become a scientist or work with science in your career, to understand what science is and how science can be a tool that's useful for you. Okay. What kinds of questions can I use science as a tool for versus what kinds of other questions can I use my faith system for or my ethical foundation for, right? So anyway, I hope that this assignment was interesting, worthwhile, made you think a little bit. All right. I'm glad y'all are here. On to week 2. Oh.